shining directly in my eyes. So we're very excited to welcome you all to the first lecture in the CIS Public Talks series this term. And we're delighted to have someone who we've been in contact with for many years come and speak to us tonight, Amin Sharif. She got her undergraduate degree in neurobiology and physiology at Purdue University in the United States. Then she shifted track a little bit and did a master's in curriculum and instruction, also at Purdue, and began to move into the environment of teaching and education and curriculum. She subsequently went to Lausanne in Switzerland, where she became involved in advocacy work and began to become interested in the topic of anti-Muslim racism, which has continued to be relevant to her work from that point onwards. And she co-founded the STAND project, which sought to counter the discourses of the far-right UDC party, the Union Démocratique du Centre. So she's continued that advocacy work here in the United Kingdom. She became chair of a Sheffield working group, becoming important on the advisory panel to the board of the organisation. She set up youth clubs for young Muslim women, and she's also, when she's got time, done a part-time PhD in sociology here at the University of Cambridge. And it's in the course of that PhD that the Centre for Islamic Studies became aware of Amina's work. We were very impressed with it. She held a studentship from the centre to help support her research. She's been an active participant in our Muslims in the UK and Europe gatherings, which happen every year or every 2 years. And her scholarship, as I'm sure many of you in the room know, has continued to look at these issues of contemporary anti-Muslim racism within the UK and Europe more broadly. And she's going to talk to us today about her ideas and her research, and I'm sure we're all very excited to welcome her to talk about the biopolitics of anti-Muslim racism. Warm welcome, Amina.
Thank you. And thank you for being here, and thank you to the organizers, Neil and Yahina. It's always great to see you, great to be back in the center. Good to see you, Paul, and everyone else. So I guess I want to start with a disclosure of sorts. This paper that I'm presenting is a work in progress, and so the ideas within it are ideas that I'm developing. So I look forward to your kind and constructive criticisms at the end. So in this paper, I'm going to argue that anti-Muslim racism must be acknowledged as a racial project that creates the conditions for the spiritual death of Muslim populations. Now, to do that, I will be analyzing Prevent's Hearts and Minds campaign to stop people from becoming terrorists. So as many of you know, Prevent is UK's counterextremism policy. It was introduced following the London Underground bombing in 2007, and it's part of the ongoing and second phase of the war on terror. And the second phase of the war on terror is marked by acts of terrorism coming home, right, being committed on British soil and being committed by so-called homegrown terrorists or individuals who identify as British. The second phase of the war on terror is essentially the turning inwards of the counter-extremism gaze towards the enemy that resides within the borders of the nation. Now, Prevent's objective, it's very simple. It's to stop people from becoming terrorists or from supporting the cause of terrorism. Given its history and its practice, Prevent has essentially constituted the British Muslim population in a particular way because it's targeted the British Muslim population with its initiatives. And it's constituted British Muslim people in 2 ways. One, as risky, i.e. as terrorists, or two, as at risk of becoming Muslim. In other words, vulnerable to radicalization. And in essence, Prevent has constructed the British Muslim population as an internal enemy population. And I'll get to that I'll elaborate that as I continue. Now, one of the ways that Prevent delivers its objective of stopping people from becoming terrorists is through an operation called the Hearts and Minds. Now, Hearts and Minds is a technique of soft power, and it comes from the military doctrine of counterinsurgency. It is essentially this low-intensity tactic of warfare, and it involves securing the emotional and cognitive support of a population as a way of destroying support for an insurgency. Now, the objective of a Hearts and Minds operation is essentially to take a potentially dangerous political subjectivity and reprogram it and neutralize it. So what's really important to me here in the Hearts and Minds campaign is that there's a process of desubjectification or remaking of a particular kind of political subjectivity. Okay. So in this paper, I interpret the Hearts and Minds campaign of Prevent not as a technique of soft power, but as a racial project. And the reason why I do that is because the target of Prevent's Hearts and Minds campaign, the British Muslims potential terrorists, is a racialized category. And the subject that the British Muslim as potential terrorist has to become, i.e. this neutralized political actor, is also a racialized category. Now, there has been, scholarship that has analyzed Prevent in terms of race and racism. And my approach to Prevent as a racial project differs from this approach that's taken in the literature, in that I see Prevent as a racial project, as opposed to merely enacting racial visions of Muslim people in Islam, as opposed to merely exacerbating existing historical conditions of anti-Muslim racism, and as opposed to simply taking up existing logics, right? I'm saying Prevent is actually a racial project in and of itself. It creates particular racial categories. It organizes these racial categories in particular ways, and it has this internal racial logic. So what's at stake with not seeing Prevent as a racial project is that we fail to see its internal logic, okay? And you're going to see that I'm arguing that Prevent's racial logic is that it takes the preservation, or it preserves white life through the death of a particular kind of Muslim subject, okay? And so going back to Hearts and Minds and this idea of desubjectification, I'm going to explain that as a process of killing a particular kind of subject. So to approach Prevent as a racial project, I draw on the notion of biopolitical racism, which is a form of population management that takes race as central to determining the internal and external enemies of a population. And race then determines who is killed as a way of allowing the flourishing of that particular population. Biopolitical racism is Foucauldian's term, or Foucault's term, it's a Foucauldian term, and it basically establishes this relationship between my life and the death of the other. It establishes what must live and what must die. For me, I draw on this Foucauldian notion of biopolitical racism to understand Prevent as a racial project. I see a biopolitical logic within Prevent, and it resides within its definition of extremism. Prevent has defined extremism as opposition to fundamental British values. For example, the rule of law, democracy, mutual respect and tolerance for other faiths. This is how Prevent is defining extremism. For me, this definition is nothing more than this racial claim that there is a clash of civilizations that's taking place. As many of you know, the clash of civilizations is Samuel Huntington's term, and it refers to this sort of clash that exists between Islam and the West that is currently underway. My understanding of the clash of civilizations is that it is a racial sort of logic, right? It posits that this clash is happening between a people who belong to the realm of religion against another people who belong to the realm of law and reason. So in this formulation, Islam is frozen in the state of nature, while the West has sort of progressed into modernity and secularity. And in this formulation, the Muslim is either lagging behind or has yet embraced modernity, or the Muslim is anti-modern and militant against modernity. And so the figure of the Muslim as anti-modern maps onto this figure of the risky Muslim, i.e. the terrorist, and the figure of the Muslim as pre-modern maps on to this figure of the Muslim at risk of becoming risky, i.e. the extremist. In any case, the Muslim is one who ontologically threatens white life, right, through terrorism, or existentially, ideologically threatens white life through, or threatens Western civilizational life through extremism. And this, the racial logic then of the clash of civilizations, I foreground in my work because it points to the war on terror, points to prevent as, you know, a racial project. And this is how I'm understanding it. And now, because prevent through this definition is identifying who its enemies are, and it's establishing that this enemy is a threat to a particular population, for me, there's this biopolitical logic here where the threat then is targeted for elimination. So at this point, you must be thinking, okay, so prevent is this biopolitical project, right? That establishes the death of Muslim life as a way of protecting white life. Then how is prevent actually enacting this biopolitical death? And my understanding of biopolitical death here is really inspired by Gracie Hong's work. And she looks at how Native Americans in Canada are sort of erased, you know, in the settler colonial logic. And her work brings her attention to the fact that biopolitical death doesn't have to take place through outright eradication or killing. It can take place through incorporation or assimilation into the dominant culture. My approach to biopolitical death also draws on the work of Jasper Topolar in her work, The Right to Name. And she observes this tactical military strategy that is deployed by the Israeli Defense Force. Idea. And she observes that this strategy doesn't have as aim outright killing, but debility, right? And the purpose of debility is to sort of manage population through maiming Palestinian people. So again, Huar's work is really important here for thinking about biopolitical death as forms of life that don't count as fully living, or death in life. And both of their work, Hong and Huar's, pushed me to think about the spiritual desubjectification that is the objective of Prevent's Hearts and Minds operation as a kind of biopolitical death. I'm getting confused which one operates the computer and which one operates the screen. Okay.
Yeah, you're totally manual for your laptop, I'm afraid. I'm not like that.
Yeah. Okay. So how can I approach the biopolitical death in this scenario of Prevent? So I draw on some of Mahmoud's work on secularism. As many of you are probably well aware, Sabah Mahmoud, she critiques this idea of secularism as the separation of church and state. For her, secularism is the active management of religion. Secularism actively manages religion. It shapes the epistemological claims that it can make, and it endorses particular kinds of subjectivities, and it's not letting religion sort of exist on its own. It's creating particular parameters for it. But more importantly, for my argument today, secularism is this modality of governance that authorizes specific forms of subjectivity, remakes religious subjectivities to render them compliant with liberal political rule. And so this notion of secularism here is one that I'm going to be thinking with as I think about biopolitical again. So again, I'm interested in Prevent's Hearts and Minds campaign, this political desubjectification of this dangerous political actor. And this dangerous political actor is being unmade through Prevent's secular governance of Islamic Islam. So I see Prevent the conditions, or I want to understand Prevent as creating the conditions for the unmaking of particular religious subjectivities. And I see these conditions in its Hearts and Minds campaign. And this campaign involves the making of a moderate Islam. So Prevent became interested in making a moderate Islam around 2011 when it shifted its focus away from violent extremism to non-violent extremism. In other words, it became interested in the ideology that leads people towards the commission of political violence. And essentially Prevent, disavowing the political conditions that lead people to commit acts of terrorism, located the cause of terrorism itself in Islam. And it began to target Islam with depoliticization, secularization, and efforts to transform Islam from within. And you can see some of these initiatives here. Prevent's efforts to create a moderate Islam are most visible in these initiatives. The Mosques and Imams National Advisory Board is a regulatory body that oversees accreditation and good governance of mosques. We have the Review of Muslim Faith Leader Training, which oversees Imam training programs, scrutinizes the curriculum, pedagogy, mainstream education, so on and so forth. We have the Contextualizing Islam in Britain project, which sought to define Islam in Britain. We have the Radical Middle Way, which tried to articulate a moderate understanding of faith, politics, and religion. You have the Scholars Roadshow, which, again, it was a series of conferences that tried to build the youth understanding of Islam and insist that terrorism is un-Islam. So I interpret these initiatives by Prevent as efforts to shape the epistemological claims that Islam can make, but more importantly for my argument, as trying to remake the religious subjectivities of British Muslims. And so I interpret Prevent's Hearts and Minds campaign as creating the conditions that create the biopolitical death of Prevent, which is unmaking of bad Muslim religious subjectivities. Yeah, okay. Last time I presented a version of this paper, I got a lot of heat. So I welcome heat, but kind heat. And we'll see where this goes. Okay. So in using the term bad Muslim, I'm drawing on the framework good Muslim, bad Muslim. And you guys might be well aware of this framework as well. It's Mahmoud Manzani's framework. And he identifies this construct of the bad Muslim as, this Muslim that is doctrinal, anti-Western, violent. And the good Muslim is modern, secular, and Westernized. And building on Mamdani's work is Shireen Razak, who argues that the good Muslim is considered redeemable, worthy of saving, inclusion within the universal, and the bad Muslim is slated to annihilation. So this is a category, this category of the good and bad Muslim sort of emerged in the post 9/11 context when Muslim people were being called upon to sort of stand with, Bush and his allies and the coalition fighting the war on terror against the bad Muslims, the terrorists, and so on and so forth. Now, in making my argument, I try to think about the good Muslim, bad Muslim framework a little differently. And so I want to think about the bad Muslim as the tawhidic Muslim and the good Muslim as the liberal Muslim. And the reason why I want to do that is because the fundamental distinction that has been established, this is not me making this up, I don't care who is a bad Muslim or good Muslim. The fundamental distinction that's been constructed by policy, by counter-extremism strategy and so forth is essentially the bad Muslim, right, practices in the good Muslim Islam, right? And we see the problem of practicing in a report produced by the National Security Research Division of Rand Corporation, okay? In a report titled Civil Democratic Islam, Partners, Resources, and Strategies, the report identifies the bad Muslim as the traditionalist Muslim. And for Rand, the traditionalist Muslim is none other than the one who believes the Quran is the literal word of God, takes the Quran and the Sunnah, the tradition of the prophets, on him be peace, and Islamic jurisprudence as guidance for everyday matters and conduct. The bad Muslim, the traditionalist Muslim, is also one who observes acts of worship such as 5 times daily prayer, fasting, veiling, and by this definition, the bad Muslim is on and other things, right? Because we wear scarves on our heads. So this is why I'm interpreting the bad Muslim as the tawhidic Muslim is the traditionalist Muslim, what the Rand Corporation is calling the traditionalist Muslim. And it's essentially a subject that is forged in relation to a non-Western epistemological and ontological horizon, right? It's a subjectivity that's forged in relation to a tawhidic metaphysics centered on this principle that there's no God but God, right? And in a tawhidic metaphysics, nothing occurs outside of divine will. God alone is the cause of every event. Human beings and all things created constitute a cosmos instead of chaos. And everything exists for a universal purpose. Okay, and that universal purpose reveals itself in a long series of prophets, the last one being the prophet Muhammad. And this is what I'm defining as the tawhidic sort of metaphysics, right? Cosmology. So the tawhidic subject is one that is forging herself in relation to this metaphysics, right? She's trying to become a particular subject as a way of establishing this universal purpose in her life. Okay, this is how I'm understanding, again, this tawhidic subject. It's a subject that submits to a particular will. The subject is not independent from authority in a liberal sense of the individual. The subject submits to a divine authority, right? And that is seen as problematic. So it's my argument that prevents that the bad Muslim subjectivity, that bases the conditions of its unmaking, by prevent, is the tawhidic subject. So the tawhidic subject is, if you will, exposed, is targeted for unmaking by prevent and its Hearts and Minds campaign. I see this in a number of places, but again, I go back to prevent's definition of extremism, which is opposition to fundamental British values. For me, what this definition tells us is that one of prevent's objectives is the restoration of the supremacy of liberal values as the cultural matrix of British society. In other words, liberal ideas, liberal thought has to be reinstalled, okay? Because there's this sense that it's under threat, the clash of civilizations, right? There's this threat to Western values. But the implication of this definition is that illiberal values are marked for eradication, right? And given the logic of prevent, given its targeting Islam for redemption, its attempts to secularize and politicize Islam, I also understand the illiberal values that are implied here in this definition as being the values that are sort of espoused by Islam. And of course, there's this constitutive relationship between Islam and liberalism. Joseph Musab brought our attention to this. He writes that Islam is the internal constituent of liberalism. It offers the very conditions of liberalism's existence, yet it's projected as its outside in order to define liberalism as its opposite. So from this perspective, I understand that the extremism that is counterposed to liberalism, it makes these kinds of references to Islam, right? Implicitly through this kind of long history of liberalism's relationship to Islam. And so, of course, then the implication again is that the tawhidic subject that I described earlier, who is trying to become and embody this praxis in relation to this metaphysics and the way we understand it, is therefore sort of targeted as the extremists. And it's the tawhidic subject who comes under scrutiny by Prevent's definition of extremism, and we actually see this in Prevent practice. We have cases where Muslim girl, for example, who decided to wear the hijab, she was referred to Prevent. We have a case where a high school pupil goes to make the hajj, comes back, and then that is seen as a sign of radicalization. That child is referred. We also have a case of a boy who is interrogated for having memorized parts of the Quran, right? So being Muslim in a particular way is flagged as a sign of radicalization by Prevent. So what I'm essentially arguing then is that Prevent's objective of restoring the supremacy of liberal values might be delivered through the unmaking of the tawhidic subject and then the making of the liberal Muslim subject. Do I have time still? Okay.
Another 10 minutes if you want.
Okay, super. So by saying that, okay, I'll repeat that because that was a lot. That was a big mouthful, you know what I mean? I'm suggesting that Prevent delivers its objective of installing the supremacy of liberal values through the unmaking of the tawhidic subject and the making of the liberal subject. And in saying that, I'm saying that the tawhidic subject is counterposed as the other of the liberal subject. I'm not saying they're necessarily, they're two separate subject positions. I'm saying they're counterposed to each other, where the tawhidic subject is the other of the liberal subject. And the good Muslim is the liberal Muslim, right? The liberal Muslim is one who constructs a selfhood that is independent from divine authority, right? Independent from that purpose that I talked about before, right? The liberal Muslim, in Sabah Mahmoud's words, is a self-choosing subject who appreciates the spiritual truths that religious tradition symbolizes, but is enlightened enough to know and understand that these truths command no epistemological force in them. So that is the ideal sort of subject that is desired in this process of, in this operations of Prevent's hearts and mind. And crucially then, that liberal subject lives a privatized form of religious subjectivity and is thus compliant with secular, political, liberal rule. So if we return then to what I mentioned earlier, Prevent's Hearts and Minds campaign is about incapacitating dangerous political subjectivities, right? And if those dangerous political subjectivities are sort of understood as being effects of particular religious subjectivities, right? Then the unmaking of particular religious subjectivities then renders those political subjects compliant with liberal rule. You can skip that page. In conclusion, the making of the liberal Muslim depends on the devitalization of the tawhidic subject. And so I'm describing Prevent as this racial project that creates the biopolitical conditions for the death of the tawhidic subject. So the devitalization of the tawhidic subject, I'm interpreting that as a kind of biopolitical death, right? It's not outright killing, but it's a kind of incorporation, right, into the dominant culture, liberal culture. And the devitalization of the Tawhidic Muslim subject, it's related to Bohr's formulation of biopolitical death as debility for the purpose of incapacitating resistance, right? Again, if a particular political or if a particular religious subjectivity becomes a political actor in a particular way, then there's a kind of incapacitation here of resistance, or incapacitation of particular forms of political behavior. Devitalized, the tawhidic subject no longer poses a threat to white life and Western civilizational life. Devitalized, the tawhidic subject experiences a form of white threat. And so this analysis of Prevent here allows me to argue that anti-Muslim racism has to be acknowledged as this racial project that creates the conditions for the spiritual death of these conditions. And I will leave it here.